everyone. Welcome to our briefing on gas stoves and our health. My name is Jen Engstrom. I'm the State Director for CalPIRG, the California Public Interest Research Group. And on behalf of our organization, our national partner US PIRG, and the state PIRGs around the country, I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us to learn about more about our health impacts of gas stoves. So in this short briefing, we are going to review the latest research on the impacts of gas stoves on our indoor air quality, our climate, and our health. We'll provide information on federal incentives that are available to the public for alternatives like induction stoves, and we'll share some policy ideas to ensure that consumers are well educated on their options. So to take us through this all, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Cassell. He is the Director of Environment Campaigns at US PIRG. And then after his briefing, we will open it up to questions in the Q&A feature. So take it away, Matt.
Thank you, Jen. And there's already a good question in the chat. Is there a difference between PIRG and CalPIRG? And the answer is yes. PIRG is the US PIRG, or PIRG is the National Federation of the State PIRGs, of which CalPIRG is a part. So we work closely together, Jen and CalPIRG in California, and me on the national team. But okay, so if you're on this webinar, I think it's probably safe to say that you've noticed some of the news stories about gas stoves lately. The flurry of news coverage began with a report about a potential gas stoves ban under consideration from regulators at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission. So despite how some have characterized this story, one myth that can be busted right away is that there is no proposed federal ban on gas stoves. I'll talk a little bit more in a little while about what is happening on the federal level. But first, I want to start with just there is a problem with gas stoves, right? There's a pollution problem with gas stoves. And I want to talk about what the research behind that problem looks like, what we can be telling people who are learning about it for the first time and how they can protect themselves. And then after talking about the federal landscape a little bit, I'll talk about some policy opportunities there may be on the state and local levels as well. So we can go to the next slide. So what is the problem with gas stoves anyway? I have here on the slide an overlooked health risk. I think we're getting to the point where it may not be overlooked so much anymore, given sort of some of the press, but I think still people are learning about this for the first time when they see a lot of this. The wave of media attention that we've seen this year so far comes on the heels of yet another peer-reviewed study showing the link between gas stoves and health harms. In this one, researchers at RMI, the University of Sydney, and the Albert Einstein School of Medicine found that gas stoves, that basically 12% or 1 in 8 of childhood asthma cases nationwide can be attributed to gas stove pollution, or are attributable to gas stove pollution. And researchers found that that's actually similar to the level of childhood asthma attributable to secondhand smoke. So it's a similar risk to secondhand smoke exposure. This is the latest in nearly 50 years of studies showing that gas stoves are bad for our health. Simply using gas stove releases significant nitrogen dioxide pollution indoors at concentrations that can exceed outdoor air quality standards. We'll look at that a little bit more in a second. And then burning methane gas in our home also releases carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, particulate matter into the air. These are similar pollutants to those we see released from a car's tailpipe, but it's in our kitchens. A major problem here is that there is no universal or national requirement that gas stoves be vented outdoors. And then compounding that, there's not enough public knowledge about the issue yet. So even people who do have ventilation don't always use it. So one of the opportunities we have to reduce exposure to pollution is not getting used as much as it should. And then I want to emphasize again, there's 50 years at least of research on this. While it seems like it's a new issue that came up out of nowhere earlier this year, that's only because it's never received the public attention that it has deserved. For too long, the narrative around gas stoves has been driven by the industry, which tells us that it's clean burning and that it's the superior way to cook. But in reality, we know that researchers and the industry have known about the health risks for decades. In fact, the other day, I saw minutes from a 1907 gas industry conference where they were talking about the health impacts of gas stoves. But there was a push in the 80s around indoor air quality where this did come up. National regulations were not put into place, but it's certainly been something that has been known and apparent for decades. It's just now that it's really reaching the public at a broader level, and we need to do more of that, I think. And that's our way forward here. Next slide. So here are the pollutants we're looking at from gas stove emissions. So this is NO2 or nitrogen dioxide is a big one and one that drives the asthma issue, but there's also carbon monoxide, which of course can be lethal at high concentrations. So when something goes wrong, but there are also health impacts at lower concentrations. And particulate matter is another problem. And you may have seen the argument in some of the coverage or in some of the responses to sort of this whole issue popping up that all cooking produces air pollution regardless of the fuel. It's one of the industry's favorite go-tos, the gas industry's favorite go-tos. While it is true that all cooking produces some level of particulate matter, so the food that you're cooking and the cooking process creates some particulate matter, but using fossil fuel power stoves results in levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution 50 to 400 times higher than in homes with electric stoves. It also leads to higher levels of particulate matter because you're getting it not just from the food that you're cooking, but also from the burning of the gas. And then so nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and some of these other pollutants, you don't get it all from electric because they're not burning gas, and you get those parts from just burning the gas. So while yes, it's true, there is some pollution involved in any form of cooking because of the cooking itself. It is not true that it's just one simple cooking problem and has nothing to do with the fuel. Clearly, the fuel that you're using to cook is highly determinative of the actual amount of pollution and what pollutants are in the air. And then finally on here on the bottom, you'll see benzene. And this one is a little bit different than the others. This actually isn't a problem associated with burning the gas in the stove. So it's not necessarily a problem when you turn the stove on. But recent studies suggest that even when gas stoves are off, they may be polluting our air because of leaks. So gas is really prone to leaking. We see this outside a lot. That's how we see some of these fires and explosions that you sometimes hear about. So faulty connections or loose cords there are all kinds of reasons why gas may be leaking in our stoves from our stoves, even when they're not turned on. And two recent studies, one from Boston, found 21 hazardous air pollutants, including benzene, leaking into homes from unburned gas. And then another similar study in California found hazardous air pollutants accumulating in homes through leaking gas, including, again, benzene, which is a known carcinogen linked to blood disorders and leukemia. Researchers at that time in California found benzene concentrations above recommended exposure limits, again, comparable to the levels you would see living with a smoker. And then finally, again, so there are all these pollutants that are associated with actually burning the methane gas and cooking on there, but these are pollutants that are getting into our homes through leaks, even when the gas stoves are turned off. Next slide. Okay, back to nitrogen dioxide for a minute. Like I said, there's no national standard or guideline for nitrogen dioxide indoors in the United States, but there are outdoor standards and there are some guidelines from the World Health Organization and in Canada that we can look to. And you can see here from this chart, that this is from an organization called RMI, pretty much any kind of cooking puts us over those standards for outdoors, which, again, this is indoors, so you think the standard should be even lower, and puts us over some of those health protective guidelines from Canada and the World Health Organization. So, baking puts us at 230 parts per million on a 1 hour, which is way over the 1 hour average exposure limits that we should be seeing. Even boiling water just boiling water puts us over that. Next slide. And then again, this all has a huge impact on childhood asthma, although it is not just children we're worried about. Breathing these pollutants is bad for all of us, but it's especially bad for kids, older Americans, or those with chronic illnesses. In terms of kids, the research shows that there's a 42% increased risk of experiencing asthma symptoms in homes with a gas stove, a 24% increased risk of being diagnosed with asthma by a doctor, and then putting them together, a 32% increased risk of both experiencing symptoms and being diagnosed by a doctor. So it's a significant factor. Next slide. Okay, so that's the problem. That's sort of what we're looking at on the research. But what's happening on the federal level? Because this is where sort of the whole story blew up, and how we've gotten to the point where there are articles in pretty much every outlet you can think of at this point. As I said, there is no proposed federal ban on gas stoves. That's just not coming. However, you can see from the CPSC chair's statement, which I put here on the slide, that the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, is looking at gas stove pollution, and they're working to measure the risk and determine what measures the Consumer Product Safety Agency can take to protect us. So this is a good thing. We need to support them in that work. There have been attacks on the CPSC over this issue in Congress, including some legislation that would limit some of their authority here. But it's important that we preserve the agency's integrity and let them do their jobs. They are the one agency tasked with protecting consumers from unsafe products. That's exactly what they're looking to do here. They're trying to figure out what is the problem and how can we best protect American consumers, and we need to let them do that. Separately, some other agencies like the EPA and the Department of Energy have appliance emissions or efficiency standards that can help, currently are not really strong enough. And then ultimately it would help to have the EPA or some other agency working on health take a stronger stance on indoor NO2, helping to set a guideline or standard. But at this point, we do not have a national indoor air quality standard or guideline for nitrogen dioxide. Next slide. Okay, what does this all mean for the regular person who has a gas stove, who's hearing about this for the first time and are worried? The idea here is not to scare people or convince people they need to rip their gas stoves out of their kitchen today. Instead, we need to be providing people with measured and helpful information about the risks and the steps they can take to protect themselves and their families. For example, first, using proper ventilation, while it's not a cure-all, it does really help. The best kind of ventilation comes from a ducted range hood installed above the stove to catch air and smoke as it rises, and then move that polluted air outside the home. If you have a ducted range hood, you always should be using it. In fact, you should turn it on before you turn the stove on and then leave it running until a minute or two after you turn the stove off, not just when you burn food or there's a lot of smoke. You should always be using it. But it is important to know also not all ducts are vented. That is, they don't all move the pollution outside of the home. Many are just fans that circulate the air inside, which doesn't provide nearly as much protection. Next slide. So if people have a gas stove and don't have a ducted vent or ventilation, what can they do? Well, there are some options that are sort of quick and easy fixes that can help. If you've got a fan, open window, so you're not just circulating it around your room, you're actually trying to get some of that outside. If you have a window fan, run it on exhaust. Always have a carbon monoxide alarm in your kitchen. Keep track of pollution levels. If carbon monoxide is high, it's likely all of those pollution levels are high. And you can, for particulate matter, get a HEPA air purifier with a carbon filter, which can help. Next slide. And then ultimately, the healthiest option is going to be to use an electric alternative to gas. And that way, we're also not just taking, more of this air pollution inside and putting it outside where it's, also has an impact. So I like to tell people, well, the next time you're in the market for a stove, or if you're considering kitchen upgrades, it's wise to consider an electric or induction option. Induction cooking, especially, is very exciting right now. It provides all kinds of benefits. Induction technology uses magnets underneath the surface to directly heat the pan. So actually, if you take the pan off, you can put your hand right on the surface and it won't burn you. So it's safer. If you have kids, I know my kids are always reaching towards my electric stove, which, is not like induction. It stays hot. You got to keep them away. This actually is safer, can prevent burns, super easy to clean. And a lot of chefs are making the switch. Professional chefs are making the switch because of the superior cooking experience it provides, from, heating up faster. You can boil water, in half as much time, to having more precise control over temperature. So this narrative that, gas stoves are the end all and be all for cooking is sort of, isn't the full story when you think about induction and the movement towards induction cooking. And then one other thing to note about electric and induction cooking is that the Federal Inflation Reduction Act does include incentives for making this switch. Right now, the Department of Energy is working on guidance, and then states will have to take that guidance and implement the rebates and incentives. And so the state agencies will be the ones that actually the incentives go through. So it's really important to make sure that DOE gets that guidance right, which they're working on right now. But then once that's done, we need to push our state agencies to implement and start getting that money out there, so it makes it easier for people to switch to induction or electric cooking. Next slide. All right. So if you rent and you can't switch out your stove, or you can't add ventilation, and you're more limited in what you're able to do, one option is to purchase a low cost, you can find these for less than $100, portable plug-in induction hot plate. These plug into normal outlets. You can put them on top of your gas stove, like you see in this picture here, or on your counter, and you can replace a lot of the cooking you otherwise would have used gas for. It probably won't replace all of your cooking, but between this and other electric appliances like toaster ovens, you can really cut down on your use of gas. I know anecdotally know a lot of people who are doing this right now, and they all love it. Next slide. Okay. All of that said, there are also opportunities at the local and state levels to pursue some policies that will help protect people. I'll just run through a few on the slides that I have here. I'm happy to talk to other people, more in depth about some of this, offline, but just some ideas here. Indoor air quality guidelines, right? Like I said, there's no indoor air quality standard or guideline on the national level for nitrogen dioxide. The more we can set local or state guidelines, the more helpful that will be. Building codes is an area where we can require adequate ventilation and other protections. We can require carbon monoxide detectors, things like automatic ventilation that can really change the way manufacturers are making these stoves. Warning labels is a good one, right? Part of the problem here is that most people don't really know the extent of this problem and what the risks are. If they see it on the stove when they purchase it, they see a warning level, they might, think, well, maybe I should look at some other options, or I should at least make sure I have the right ventilation for this. Finally, incentives. so we've got some federal incentives. Some states already have their own incentives for electric or induction options, and adding state incentives or local incentives on top of the federal incentives makes it even easier for people to make the switch and absorb that upfront cost. Next slide. And then leading by example, public funds shouldn't be used to purchase and install appliances that could pose a health risk in homes, schools, and other public buildings. And then for tenant protections, like we do with lead, we could require landlords to provide notice to tenants about the gas stove pollution risk in apartments or homes that are rentals that have gas stoves. Okay, so that was a quick run through of the research of sort of where we're at the federal level, what some of the practical solutions are, what some of the policy solutions can be. Happy to answer questions. I know there's a lot more happening on this issue. I'm sure you have some questions. So let's just go ahead and open it for questions now.
If you have a question, you can throw it in the Q&A or the chat. I can give folks a moment to do that. While people are typing in their questions, one question I have, Matt, is if there is a way for states or a role that states can play in helping with the efforts at the CPSC.
Yeah, so what the CPSC is doing, the first thing they're doing is they're going to be opening up a request for information or public input period, probably starting in March or April, where they'll be soliciting public input on the hazards and risks of gas stove pollution and what some of the potential solutions are. I think it would be really good for them in that process to hear from local electeds, to hear from states that there's support for the CPSC taking on this issue and doing more to protect Americans from the pollution. So there's that, there's sort of responding to the CPSC's request for information. And then the other thing is just, at the federal level, making it clear to our federal representatives and electeds that these attacks on the CPSC, these attempts to sort of strip the CPSC of some of their authority here are unwarranted and in fact counter to the public interest, and that our federal electeds should not be supporting those.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about prices, so I'll ask you both. So one is, are induction stovetops coming down in price? And then related, we have the question of what is the cost difference between installing electric stoves versus gas?
Yeah, so on whether they're coming down in price, I think they have been a little bit. I'm hearing there's some increased demand for induction, which probably will curtail any reductions in price, at least for now, which is again why I think the incentives that we can provide people are really important to make sure that, they are a little bit more expensive. They're definitely more expensive than an electric stove, right? Gas stoves sort of run the gamut, right? You've got your sort of run-of-the-mill gas stoves that are going to be cheaper than an induction. You've got your high-end gas stoves that are going to be more expensive. But if you're buying at that level, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. But yes, induction stoves on average are going to be a little bit more expensive. I don't know that they're going to significantly come down in price in the very short near term, making those incentives now really important. I should also say, though, there are low cost induction options, like I mentioned, the hot plate, or even some of the cooktops with even more burners, rather than buying the whole unit. You can save some money by doing that. And then the other question was the price difference. Yeah, it depends a little bit on the models that you're looking at. Generally, the induction models at each level are going to be a little bit more expensive than the gas and electric options at each level. You'll often find the electric ones are the least expensive. I have a really nice smooth top electric stove that I really like. But so they're sort of they sort of run the gamut, with induction trending to a little bit more expensive still.
Okay, there's a question about the use of gas stoves for heating, that sometimes people will use it for heating. I imagine, if there's a power outage. And so there's a question about, just that, and how landlords in particular, when it comes to renters, can engage in health risk conversations with their renters with that tension, I guess.
Yeah, so there's a real problem here, right? In that when people lose power, most gas appliances don't work when you lose power. Often your gas stove will. That allows people to cook during power outages, which is good. It also often means that people are using their gas stoves to heat their homes during power outages, especially, winter weather related power outages. It's a hard thing to deal with, right? Because it's either you're very cold and you're running a risk there, or you're pumping your home full of pollutants, including carbon monoxide. And in fact, the real carbon monoxide, one of the real serious carbon monoxide risks of gas stoves is when you're doing just that. You're using it to heat your home. And so I think there is a conversation to be had. Like, we need to have that conversation about the dangers of using your gas stove to heat your home, and what alternatives there are and what options there are for people. Great if we could get some of that information from landlords. I think governments need to be thinking about this too. Like, how do we react to some of these emergency situations and provide people with the care and the heat and the food that they need? In terms of cooking, there are also options. We're starting to develop induction cooktops that actually either work on a battery or have a battery pack. So you might actually be able to keep that charged and cook during a power outage. Of course, an induction stove wouldn't keep your home heated in the same way that a gas stove would, but also doesn't have the carbon monoxide risk. So I think this is a difficult conversation. I think there are people who rely on this in times of emergencies, and we want to make sure that those people are actually getting really good options, and we're dealing with it at the same time that we're dealing with this also very real problem that gas stoves just regularly cause a health risk in our home. And so to the extent we can move away from them, we should be.
Okay, and then this is a little less related to health, but on just costs of utility bills have been going up. I think both electric and heating, and so there's just a question about addressing just the increased bills.
Yeah, well, induction stoves are far more efficient than gas, and even more efficient than electric stoves. So to the extent that helps, right? They'll still run on whatever electric grid that you're running on. So if it's a grid powered by gas and gas prices go up, you'll still see an increase in prices, right? So it's important, of course, both for climate reasons, but also for these like price stability reasons, that at the same time we're switching out appliances and electrifying our homes, we're also dealing with the electric grid, right? We need to be integrating more renewable energy into our electric grid, so that we're not, just transferring the problem to the electric grid side. So I think ultimately it'll help. It definitely helps on efficiency, but it really helps if we're doing this in a coordinated way with our efforts to integrate more renewable energy into our grid.
Okay, great. Okay, last call for questions. All right. Oh yeah, so then there's just an ask for your contact information.
Oh yeah, of course. If I type in the chat, is everybody able to see that?
I think so. I'll be able to share it too.
There's my email. And then I also just want to share 2 resources. Here as well. And these, so the one is about sort of the current landscape and the health risks, and the other is about induction technology and some of the incentives that are available to help people make the switch to induction.
Great. Okay, I shared those, and then I'll also send an email out to everybody who attended with some of these resources as well. So thank you all. If you have, again, further questions or some specific questions around policy, feel free to reach out. And thank you all for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.